Okay. And I thought you are here. You're not here.
I'm looking into the milk.
I see. Thank you very much. Okay. It's a recording. Okay. Yeah, we can turn it off if you're here.
No, I'll take it.
Okay. Well. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see everyone. So I'd like to sort of just try and move forward a little bit in from a bit more direct focus on Jewish the sort of Jewish philosophy behind anti-Semitism. We discussed things rather broadly over the last few weeks. And I outlined last time 6 or 5 or 6 classic sources around the causes of anti-Semitism: human free will, tzorchacha and punishment, jealousy around Jewish uniqueness or spirituality, an alienness, the idea of us, thank you, the idea of us being aliens, covenantal relationship with Hashem, and we saw some overlap between these ideas. I also spoke at length last week about what I think is a path that we can navigate between accepting a spiritual dimension to anti-Semitism and the classic hashkafic position, Jewish position, that our spiritual behavior can impact on our vulnerability to anti-Semitism, and at a time like this, we should be engaging in teshuvah, in tefillah, in achdus, in enhanced chesed, and the like. And a path that we can walk that can accept that at the same time as not giving up on naturalistic explanations of the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, being able to engage with military solutions in the context of Israel, political attempts in the context of the diaspora, and communication and democracy, fighting back and so on, and also avoiding slipping into victim blaming. And I spoke about the Rambam's formulation, who sees our decline in spirituality as making us more vulnerable to the natural forces of the world. So someone I forgot, I didn't ask their permission whether I could say B'Shem Omram, so someone here someone in the community just gave me a succinct sort of summary of what I was trying to say, because it got a little, in some ways, a little profound last week. And they said if we use the analogy of anti-Semitism as a virus, then we can think of our spirituality, amongst other things, as being part of our immune system. There's other things perhaps in the immune system, such as our efforts in diplomatic and political and military hishtadlus and the like. But one of the factors of our immunity to anti-Semitism is our spiritual state, our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the point of this analogy is that on the one hand, raising our spiritual game can create greater immunity to anti-Semitism. Lessening it can make us more vulnerable to anti-Semitism. And yet at the same time as saying that, we can recognize it as a virus. We're not blaming ourselves for the phenomena of anti-Semitism. And I think that's an important sort of balancing act. We're not the cause of anti-Semitism, we are not the cause of anti-Semitism. We do not take responsibility for it. It's the decision of our enemies and free will and other aspects. On the other hand, part of what we need to do to enhance our vulnerability are ruchnius solutions and spiritual solutions alongside our entirely appropriate hishtadlus and sort of physical and political and economic and material efforts. So that's one way of sort of thinking about it, like a succinct summary of the balance we're trying to get. Or in the formulation of the Rambam, as I said, as we lessen our spiritual status, we become more vulnerable to mikra, we become more vulnerable to natural forces of nature, and part of that, sadly and tragically, is the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. So this is a summary of really where we're up to. I just want to spend a little bit of time sharing some of the classic sources where we see some of these reasons, as it were, for anti-Semitism outlined, because I advanced basically 5 classic models of anti-Semitism, which don't mutually contradict, but may all be accurate. And I just want to share some of the sort of Mara Makom, some of the classic Mamori Chazal that we have around this. We have a Gemara in Shabbos. It's an Akadatuk Gemara, a Midrashic Gemara, and the Gemara is Doresh, the name Sinai, Har Sinai. And it says, what's the etymology of the word Sinai? And it says, Shemisham rather, Yarda Sina La'olam, La'umas Olam. That at Har Sinai, Sinai is Sina, hatred descended to the Gentile nations of the world at Sinai. So part of the Sinai covenant, part of accepting Torah at Har Sinai, was that this would create anti-Semitism. That would be one of the consequences of it. Which means some of the explanations we said, it's not entirely clear which one. It may be that there would be a resentment of Jewish uniqueness, and maybe there would be resentment of a Jewish spiritual message. It may be this is part of the covenantal relationship. But you see sort of Chazal saying in some way, which isn't entirely clear to us, a intertwining of Sinai and Sinai, Har Sinai, as somehow intertwining. So again, this is a medrash, but nonetheless, the Chazal seem to be expressing this idea that they're seeing a link between what nowadays we would call anti-Semitism and or anti-Jewish hatred and Har Sinai. Yeah. Yes. Right. They're traitors, potential traitors, yes. Yeah. Okay. So someone is asking live about the pre-Sinai anti-Semitism that we see in Egypt, which seems to be down to the alienness of the Jewish people, Jews as aliens. So you're correct. There's different explanations of anti-Semitism. The Ivri component of anti-Semitism, which we'll see some of the classic sources later, is seeing Jews as aliens, exists already from perhaps Avraham Avinu and onwards. But the covenantal element, or one of the covenantal elements, Bris Bein Absarim, is again Fi Matan Torah, from Avraham Avinu. But the Sinai covenantal element, or the uniqueness, or the spiritual jealousy, is a Sinai phenomenon. That's what Chazal seems to be saying. So indeed, you see the different aspects, the different strands of anti-Semitism there, and different explanations. To the best of my knowledge, the Gemara doesn't explain in greater detail, as far as I remember, what it means by this link between Sinai and Sinai. There is a medrash, a relatively late medrash called Medrash Lekach Tov. As an aside, I'm not going to go into now. Maybe we can talk about it as its own topic. I gave a series on Peshat and the Torah, reading the Torah on Peshat. We touched on Medrash there, but we never really did the opposite conversation, which is Medrash and reading the Torah. But people often, when Medrashim date from, is not always not all medrashim are of equal antiquity, and each medrash needs to be understood in the same right. Anyway, there is a medrash Lekach Tov, which quotes this Gemara or says a similar quote, Sheyadzim imenu sina la'olam, or and he says Shein mekanim es Yisrael b'Torasam, because they are jealous of Klal Yisrael and their Torah. So this is an interesting idea that there's an aspect of jealousy in this. The Rambam in his Igeres Teiman. So the background to this is in the life of the Rambam, Yemen went through a terrible phase of persecution, and the Yemenite Jews appealed to the Rambam for spiritual chizuk and material help. The Rambam was close to Saladin, and they saw the Rambam as having political connections. He was his doctor. And also the Rambam was the spiritual leader of that generation, or in that part of the world, or Jews in that part of the world. And they appealed to the Rambam for help. We don't know if the Rambam's political lobbying had effect. We do know that Saladin did intervene in Yemen and toppled the fundamentalist Muslim government there. So basically the background is that fundamentalist Muslim government arose in Yemen, and Saladin toppled that government and appointed his brother as a governor there. Whether that was somewhat triggered by the Rambam or anyway fitted Saladin's aims and so on, probably both, we don't really know. But either way, the Rambam wrote a letter, an epistle, a letter to Yemen, Igeres Teiman, very, very important and interesting letter. And in it, amongst other things, he addresses anti-Semitism. Very, very interesting to see the view of the Rambam on anti-Semitism. And the Rambam says one of the explanations he gives to anti-Semitism, he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was us, singled us out with our mitzvahs. And he doesn't just mean by that therefore we're alien and different, but he says, the nations were jealous of our faith, V'yilch zu malkeim b'shvila la'ar aleinu sitna ve'eva. And their leaders stirred them up, therefore, to hatred because of jealousy of our unique relationship to Hashem. So what the Rambam writes. He also, by the way, identifies there are two forms of anti-Semitism. We discussed many weeks back 3 types of anti-Semitism. He identifies a physical anti-Semitism, which is persecution, and a spiritual anti-Semitism, which is assimilation. He goes on a very interesting letter. What can we say about the historicity of this claim? Do we have any evidence of spiritual jealousy around this? So we find 3 types of anti-Semitic claims that link to this. There certainly is a strata of anti-Semitism which explicitly resents our claim to be the chosen people. Now, whether they mean by that a jealousy of our status as of chosen people, or more likely just find it arrogant and they want to use it as a proof that you're really to blame for anti-Semitism because you're anti-Gentile back in your claim of chosenness, isn't entirely clear, but that you do find a history of that. Then you find I'm no expert. I want to stress I don't know much about Judaism, Kal V'chomer, anything about other faiths, but in my reading I have come across several writers who speak about a sense of in the early days of Islam, even pre perhaps the founding of Islam and the emergence of their claimed prophet, a sort of resentment in Arab tribes that they hadn't been given a revelation, they hadn't had their share of prophecy, they hadn't been given prophets. And certainly in early iterations of Muhammad's spiritual vision, it seems that he thought that he was just going to be, even to this day, Islam just sees him as another prophet along the long list of prophets, the last and final and greatest prophet. But it seems that there was an iteration in which he saw himself simply as bringing an Arabized version of Judaism to the Arab tribes. In other words, he was saying, we felt this longing for a direct connection with Hashem. Why should that be the unique Jewish privilege? We're also going to have that privilege. And then later we know that the evolution of his frustration that Jews didn't accept his mission, and some of the anti-Jewish sort of strata thought in Islam emerging from that frustration that wasn't that his message wasn't accepted by the Jews around. Maybe some Jews did. There seems to be some evidence that there were some Jews who did accept his prophecy, but obviously meant most others who didn't. So there does seem to be. It seems that in the Arabian Peninsula of that time, there was stirrings of spiritual seeking and almost a thirst for spirituality. And possibly, the Rambam again was writing obviously within the context of the Muslim world. Possibly there were still streams of that in which there was some almost jealousy of the unique Jewish relationship to Hashem. We also, again, I'm no expert on this, far from being an expert, but my reading I've come across claims that as Christianity made the leap from being a sort of Jewish sect to primarily preaching to the Gentiles, and made that switch. Again, there were stirrings of jealousy around. So without going through the whole history of Christianity, as we know, it emerged as a Jewish sect. And whilst the early Christian leaders in that generation were perhaps frustrated at their brethren's refusal to accept their founder's message, it wasn't an anti-Semitism of any sort, because these were Jews amongst Jews. It was maybe a milchemet achim, a sort of civil frustration. But Christianity at the time was very, very small. As it morphed over to the Gentile world, when, as we know, really virulent, nasty anti-Semitism eventually crept in. Also, there seems to be some evidence that part of this was driven by, why should only the Jews have revelation? Why should they have this unique relationship to Hashem? And the sort of the idea of the New Testament as a new covenant, testament meaning covenant of sorts, and the new Israel and the replacement, this whole replacement ideology and theology and everything else, seems to have been linked to resentment. Why should there be one unique nation that has a special covenantal relationship with Hashem? So again, these are some of the ideas that perhaps are hinted at by the Rambam in his Against Teiman, and dating back even to Chazal earlier in their sources. From what I can tell, the Lekach Tov seems to have been written or finally concluded during a Christian era of dominance. The Gemara, of course, is written in Bovel, in an environment which is neither Christian nor Muslim. It's in pagan Bovel, and the Rambam, of course, is writing in in Arabian to people in the Arabian Peninsula. He's writing deep within the Muslim world. So, but either way, this is what they this is what the sources say. A second set of sources are tochacha linked sources, very, very, very classic sources that speak about, obviously, the message of the tochacha is if we sin, we will suffer. And part of that suffering is, it's interesting that the tochacha doesn't quite speak about anti-Semitism or Jew hatred. It speaks about terrible Jewish suffering, but not necessarily targeted at Jew hatred. In other words, did the Romans have a unique Jew hatred, or did they simply want Eretz Israel to be part of their empire? And pesky Jews who kept on rebelling had to be repressed, and ultimately that ended in the destruction of Beis Hamikdash and the persecution of occupied Eretz Israel and the selling into slavery of many Jews. Can we really call that Jew hatred in a classic sense? And the answer is not really around the time of the Churban Beis Hamikdash. And we find it later creeping into Roman writing, particularly as Rome moved Christian and eventually Christianity became the state religion, Constantinople and everything. But we don't, Constantine rather, I'm sorry, we don't really find classic anti-Semitism in it. So using the tochacha as a source for what we now call a uniquely Jewish hatred is maybe not such a good source. But the idea that Jewish suffering is linked to our spiritual failure is there in the tochacha, and the idea that this is a way of bringing us back to our senses certainly finds a prominent claim. In other words, the idea that if we begin assimilating and forget the differences between us and the non-Jewish world, that we have unique responsibility of keeping Torah mitzvahs and a unique mission in the world and everything else, the idea that we'll be forcibly reminded of that is there in the classic sources. Interestingly, though, the earliest sort of clear formulations that I could find of this are relatively late. In other words, even though the ideas are floating around the whole time and really emerge from the Torah itself and the tochacha, the sort of specific formulation of if you forget your identity, I'll begin knocking you back into shape and remind you emerges when? Emerges as assimilation begins arising in the era of the Enlightenment and sort of in the 1700s and on. Now, this isn't surprising because until that point, there wasn't really. Again, there were ways when this happened. So Roman Jews were perhaps assimilating in the the first centuries of the Common Era. There was obviously degrees of assimilation in Spain in the 1300s, but in the modern context, the ideas of a sort of a world in which 90% of Jews are obviously in the 1700s it wasn't in 90%, but rising very fast up, which Jews are just losing their Jewish identity, is really a relatively recent phenomena. If you look through the ages, the number of Jews that are pre 1600s or 1650s voluntarily converting to Christianity or Islam is very, very small. There was always the idea of Muslim Christians in Spain in the 1400s, Jews to Christianity in Spain in the 1400s and late 1300s, Jews in Spain and North Africa in the 1200s under Muslim fundamentalism. There was always the idea of forcible conversion, but the idea of but voluntary conversion, as it were, is a very, very tiny phenomena in Jewish history till the dawn of modernity, and that's when you first find sources using this formulation of if we forget our identity, then they will remind us forcibly of our identity. And particularly in the writings of the pre-First World War and interwar era, you have a lot of that. So long before the rise of Hitler, decades before the rise of Hitler, you do have very specific sources, the Hamakdava, the Netziv, the Rosh Hashiva Volozhins, we're talking in the late 1800s, the Meshech Chochmah before the First World War in the early 1900s, famous passage from the Meshech Chochmah, which reads like almost prophetic, poetic language. Oy lahem shekorin Berlin Yerushalayim. Right, woe is to those who call Berlin Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem. And he says, I see an Aish, a fire coming out of Berlin that will consume. So very, very near prophetic passages, really. But those are, again, if anyone here or online can share with me earlier sources, I'm no Rocky or expert on these. But interesting, when what we now consider a very classic formulation of anti-Semitism didn't quite crystallize in the modern formation till the modern era, which is not a surprise because this is taking a classic idea of Yiddishkeit really in the tochacha, but giving it a modern formula. Obviously, this emerges in the modern formula in the modern era. So these are just some of the classic sources around this. Then you find, and I'll just mention as a side, she's not a classic source, but there should be a marriage in memory of her, of Anne Frank, Hashem Yinakim Doma. She writes about this explicitly in her diary. Very interesting. Also, she wasn't, as far as I understand, raised in a particularly knowledgeable Jewish home. She obviously was very conscious of her Jewishness and had some Jewish knowledge, but I think it was a relatively assimilated home that she was raised in. But in her diary, amongst other things, the experience of Nazism begins raising more significantly her Jewish consciousness, and she gives a lot of thought to anti-Semitism. And then she also writes very interestingly. She says, I think this is she says what has caused all of this. And she says, who knows, it might even be, she speculates, it might even be our religion, from which the world and all people learn good, and for that reason, and only that reason, we suffer. So it's interesting that some of these ideas seem to have, even by Jews under persecution, sort of been ideas that emerge. There is a variant of this idea, which isn't so much jealousy, but resentment. In other words, somehow that Jews are weakening the world by their morality, and this sort of emerges from Nietzsche and from Hitler writes to that. There's in Mein Kampf. I don't want to dwell too much on his writings for obvious reasons, but he does speak about this idea that somehow Jewish morality is an offense against humanity. Humans are meant to be strong. We're meant to be the Ubermensch. We're meant to be the Superman that can just defy all constraints and do what we want, and might is right, and the strong human being can conquer the world. And Judaism comes along through Judaism directly and through Christianity, and it somehow effeminates this masculine power that humans are meant to have, and Judaism is a weakening of the human spirit. It doesn't allow humans to flourish, and it introduces guilty conscience into the world. And post-Judaism and its daughter religions, it doesn't allow us just to engage in the full vitality and pleasures of life and wildness of life and strength of life with a guilt-free conscience and so on. So these are some similar ideas that somehow the Jewish. It's interesting. It's not quite jealousy here. It's the opposite of jealousy. It's a resentment of a spiritual message. Jews are the constant nudnik that every time you're just about to enjoy yourself, they come along and say, no, halacha, halacha. You're in a kiddush and you're about to share a bit of juicy lashon hara, and someone comes along and says, lashon hara. That's the sort of motivation of anti-Semitism in this model. Again, I couldn't find classic Jewish sources for this idea, but it is something that seems to emerge in yeah.
Antisemitism as it applied for that woman, that 1879.
Yes.
The very article by Wilhelm Marx is the victory of Judaism, Judentum over Deutschtum.
That's interesting.
Judaism over Germanism. They saw it that Judaism would. Not spiritual things necessarily. They looked at the whole of the Jewish world. And that is the beginning of racial anti-Semitism. When anti-Semitism. But
they're talking about cultural dominance or religious and spiritual dominance?
No, they wouldn't have been into spiritual.
It wasn't this Nietzschean sort of right.
It would have been into that they were just gradually
taking over, Jews taking over everything. Yeah. I mean, the myth of Jews taking over everything really gets back to your point, right? The Paro claim that Jews are going to take over and they're going to ally themselves with the enemy. Again, the modern formulation of it, I couldn't find classic sources for exactly. Does Jewish ostentatiousness and Jewish prominence cause anti-Semitism? We say in the Haggadah, right? They stood out there, and there are more recent sources that sort of say wherever you looked, you saw a Jew. The best seats in the theatre and the opera house, and all these sorts of things. But again, I couldn't find that till relatively modern sources. The idea that Jews should dampen down their prominence. So again, when I say modern, I mean from the 1800s and on. I don't know if they're classic sources around that, but again, I may be wrong. Yeah.
About the Purim story, doesn't the Gemara attribute what happened to the Jews joined in the benefit, etc. So there was a kind of assimilation already at that time. And maybe the Gemara says, in a sense, we were punished.
100%. I want to emphasize this again. The idea that Jewish failure leads to persecution, 100%. most of the time it's not specifically. Look, we say the Shalosh Averos Chameros, right? Avodah Zarah Gelaros Shechasomim led to the Churban by Rishon, the first Beis Mikdash. Sinas Chinam led to the Churban by Sheni, the second Beis Mikdash. In both those cases, though, it doesn't quite smell like classic Jewish hatred because these are empires expanding and Jews get caught up in it. The Haman story is Jewish hatred. It's uniquely targeted at Jews because of Jewish difference. Their law is different. So you do find this idea there of difference in the Haman story. That definitely fits that trope. You also find in that story reward and punishment. It's because the Jews are losing. Indeed, they engage in the sort of Achashverosh and so on. I couldn't find though anyone that sort of spells this out in the modern formulation of you risk losing your identity, I'll remind you forcibly of that. I'm not claiming that this is a new idea. The Meshech Chochmah and Netziv and all these Kassalos are coming very, very much grounded in Midrashim and in Chazal, but it doesn't get that sharpness of formulation. I couldn't find anywhere where it's sort of explicitly said like that of you forget your identity, I'll bring you back forcibly. It's more said in the structure of classic schar v'onesh of reward and punishment and tochacha. They're not different ideas, but it's not that sharpness of formulation which we take as like a very modern given. Again, I think a lot of sort of machshava is finding different nuschos, different formulae to encapsulate in a way that we can hear classic ideas. That formula, I believe, to the best of my knowledge, is a new formula, though it's based and grounded on a classic idea. And within each new formulation, something is slightly changed in how you hear it. Even the way we're talking about anti-Semitism as a virus, right? It's only I don't know, it's a relatively recent metaphor, several decades or whatever. So, but it captures something. The formulation, the chitzonius, the means of expressing an idea, has a pnim internal effect on how we relate to it, for sure. Yeah.
In the Jewish form, you see what's expressed. How we can ask not within Judaism.
Do you find that what? Sorry, that's. I was on something.
Question that maybe Jewish practices of cultural relation of the time. Maybe it's around money and maybe it's about superstition.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay. So I'll just say the question online because it's a very important question, and I'm going to actually embed. I'm going to take your question as a small part of a larger question. Are there aspects of Jewish behavior that trigger anti-Semitism? Are there things that we do that trigger anti-Semitism? Either things that we do wrongly, like ostentationism, that are out of line with Jewish values, or things that we do in line with Jewish values? Are there primitive Jewish practices that cause anti-Semitism? Are there anti-Gentile tropes within Judaism that cause anti-Semitism, and so on and so forth? Now, I've sort of avoided all of this for several reasons. One is because I don't think any of that justifies anti-Semitism. So we, like any other group of people, are not perfect. And you can pick on and find areas of Jewish failing, but do they and should they justify anti-Semitism? The answer is no, of course they shouldn't. So I'm reluctant to go down that path. In other words, can an anti-Semite pick on areas of Jewish flaws and areas where, like any other people, we have our share of criminals or arrogance or whatever, and use that to say, well, look at these Jews. Of course they can do that. They can choose to do that. The question is, would you do that with any other people? Would that be justified to do with any other people? Is there surveyed evidence that we have a higher rate of these sorts of things and so on? So I was sort of reluctant to go down that path of victim blaming. I don't know, Hasidish Lavush, walking around with very visibly different differences. Is that a justification for anti-Semitism? Now, there have been times in our history where that has been seized on, and not always is it anti-Semitism when that occurs. So when Russia is modernizing, wants to forcibly drag its population into modernity, they are persecuting Jews who are dressing in classic fashion, alongside Russian Orthodox priests who are dressing differently. So from our point of view, we may need to look at it as a spiritual experience because it's a forcible attempt to assimilate, and it is a directed, targeted attack against, let's say, a classic Jewish way of looking, but it's not, I don't know if it classically qualifies as unique anti-Semitism. When Hungary, as it wants to exert nationalism and independence from at the time still the Habsburg Austrian Empire, wasn't it, Austria-Hungary, creates laws in which it bans Jews speaking Yiddish and so on. It's doing that to several ethnic groups. So again, it's difficult to exactly, and in modernity now, why should Hasidic dress justify anti-Semitism in a multicultural world in which people can walk around in any other dress that's different to classic Western appearance, and we celebrate it, right? The other ethnicities are entitled to celebrate their cultural dress and so on in a multicultural world. So one second, so I don't think it's I think anti-Semites can grab onto it, but not necessarily justify it. Then you have, with the dawn of Enlightenment and modernity, very much this trope of Jews being backwards and primitive and superstitious, and that's from figures as great as Voltaire and so on. Part of Moses Mendelssohn's mission was to try and convince both Jews and non-Jews that we can be sophisticated as the best as the best non-Jewish thinkers. So he wants to stop Jews speaking their jargon, which is not Yiddish in West Europe, but like a Judo-Deutsch, a sort of Jewish German type of German. And he wants them to speak better German, not just to educate them, because he wants them to be able to hold their own and speak an unaccented, educated German. And he wants to convince Germans that Jews are really just another branch of Christianity, another Protestantism, that Judaism is as modern and forward-thinking and not parochial. But in a way, all of this is just part of the morphing virus of anti-Semitism. So each era finds in Judaism something that clashes with the values of the era and can choose to see that as anti-Semitism if they're not willing to tolerate difference. So, just as modernity arises and you think, oh, classic Christian anti-Semitism is going to come to an end, again, there's another mutation of this virus, and now it begins attacking Judaism for being all the things that Christianity was 100 or 200 years previously. So if Judaism isn't the correct type of belief in the 1400s or 1500s because it refuses to accept, frankly, paganistic elements of Christianity, and in a sense Judaism is more rationalist than that, and it won't accept this idea that God can somehow impregnate a woman and that man can be God, and things which are paganistic in somehow in Christianity. Suddenly 150 years pass, and now you think, okay, great, Christianity is losing its grip on, superstitious grip on human minds. Surely anti-Semitism is going to come to an end, and suddenly Judaism is blamed for being too superstitious, or it's blamed for having introduced the poison of Christianity into the world by very forward-thinking philosophers of that era. So yes, there's very, very classic sources in which the ghetto huddling superstitious Jew is accused of. You see this here in the UK. When there was a lot of poverty in the East End, I'm talking about not even in the interwar years. I'm talking about in the 1800s, and Jews are accused of the pickpocketing, the Charles Dickens stereotype, and the pickpocketing Jews, the crime-ridden streets of the UK, of the East End, and the equivalent in America. So yeah, the Jews are accused of that, and sometimes you see. I want to be careful how I label this, but almost Jewish shame around this and Jewish activism to try and assimilate the Jewish population in order to counter this type of anti-Semitism. So again, thinking the solution to this will be, let's deal with it. So you have what we now recognize is a very beautiful, unique Jewish language that developed with its own culture and its own beauty and its own rhythm and its own humor and its own poetry, which is the Yiddish language, right? Adopted now by actually re-adopted now by elements of the far left who want a Jewish language. There isn't Hebrew and so on. But Yiddish has become recognized as a very beautiful language. But for 200 years, it was hated by modernizers who referred to it, wouldn't even give it its name. It's a jargon. It's this bastard tongue. It's not a real language. Now what makes it not a real language? Why can't you have uniquely Jewish blends of German and some Slavic languages and Hebrew and Aramaic, which reflects the Jewish European experience? But there was this drive against it, so it was repopularized by the East European Maskilim, which was really a form of Jewish self-hatred. That's really what it was. On a practical level, it may be useful for Jews to learn to speak polished German, but there's no evidence that Yiddish was a less successful language in allowing Jews to express ideas that Jews wanted to talk about. On the contrary, so you know, and again, I want to be careful how I say this. But if you look at the founding charter of even institutions like JFS and so on, around some of that stuff was an attempt by Jews who had arrived earlier in England, embarrassed by their East European brethren arriving in England, and wanting to anglicize them as quickly as possible. So there's much more that can be said around anti-Semitism than I can possibly cover in this share. But yes, there is such a school of thought, 100%. Sorry, Dan, was originally.
Daniel's point, if you take the Hellenists, they didn't like Bris Milah or Shabbos.
Thank you.
Because it was a weakening of the perfect body. I mean, that was a practice that they hated, which they tried to stop.
Yep. And see, Jewish primitivism. Thank you. I'm making a note of that. Yes, absolutely right. So those online, Lenda's just reminded us of the Misyavnim, the Jews who adopted Greek fashions and culture and hated their fellow Jews. Who for their refusal to adopt Jewish culture. Again, we get to the difficulty of can the Greek push to spread Hellenistic values encountering resistance amongst the Jews? Can that be labeled as anti-Semitism? Yes. Can that be labeled as anti-Semitism or not? Or is it just part of a general drive to Hellenize the whole area of which Jews fall into this? So from a Jewish point of view, this is clearly anti-Jewish because it's trying to destroy our faith. But from a external point of view, it may just be a general Hellenistic push, which Jews get caught up in and therefore affect us. But yeah, that is an example of a sort of self-hate that emerges in Jews, which Jews hate their own culture and so on. Okay, so that, yes. Okay, so it's a little earlier than the 1900s, but no. The question again is there any anti-Israel element? No, because Jews aren't there in Eretz Israel in large numbers. There's tiny Jewish population. There's no Jewish nationalism. Again, this is another example of the morphing of the virus of anti-Semitism, because Zionism is a complicated topic, and there were numerous different motives for the emergence of Zionism in the 1800s, from obviously religious ones to there's a variety of different motives for it. But one school of thought thinks it's going to be the solution to the problem of anti-Semitism. The reason for anti-Semitism is because not a solution in the sense of how we now look at it as that we have a state and we have an army to protect us and so on, but a more philosophical solution. The problem of the Jews is that they're different. There's Germans, there's Italians, there's French people, there's Russians, but there isn't a Jewish state. We're just scattered and foreigners in every country where we live. If we can make a Jewish state, then Jews will just be another nation. There'll be French and there'll be English people and there'll be Jews So it was another example of where it was thought that if Jews could regularize and normalize themselves, that would resolve the issue. And then anti-Semitism again morphs into that also. But no, to the best of my knowledge, there's no example of that. And the last time, obviously, that we had the state 2,000 years ago, again, as far as I can see, in Greek literature, there is some specifically anti-Jewish stuff. But as far as I can tell, in the Romans, in the year 70, when they're destroying the Beis Hamikdash, this is not an anti-Jewish thing. This is, from our point of view, we see it as Yad Hashem and as a Jewish experience. And that's correct, it was a Jewish experience. But from a Roman point of view, they're simply doing what they want to do, which is conquer areas and make them part of the empire. And if they rebel, they raze it to the ground. It's not a driven anti-Semitic. There may have been tensions around Roman paganism and Jewish monotheism and so on, but we don't find that to the best of my knowledge, as a driver of what's going on. There is some evidence of some unique Greek anti-Semitism, specific anti-Jewish stuff because of Jewish monotheism against the philosophical system of the Greeks or the pagan system of the Greeks and so on. But I don't think the Romans are driven by that. So the last time we had a state, I don't think it was a cause of anti-Semitism. And then in the 1800s, there's no Jewish state for that to be a driver of this. Possibly around the Zionist congresses, possibly this is part of the trigger of the forgery of protocols of the elders of Zion, this idea that Jews meet together. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but I've seen this once. So it may be, but again, it's not that anti-Zionism is a cause of anti-Semitism. It may be the idea of prominent Jewish leaders meeting and talking behind closed doors about plots. It sort of feeds into that, but nothing more than that. Okay, so this is these are just some of the classic sources of anti-Semitism. I want to just really attempt to conclude this by looking at yeah. Sorry, yeah.
They said so the Yaakov and the reason
Yeah.
hating us because of the way Abraham treated Ishmael in last week's lecture, I think it was.
So there's yes, there's
too simplistic, easy way of explaining it.
I'm just getting something online. I'll come to you in a moment, Charles, but I'll just take this. Chaucer Prioress Tale, circa 1400s, clear call to anti-Semitism, veiled blood libel. Yeah, but as far as I understand, that's the person who posted that, Dan. Tell me if I'm wrong. But the Chaucer, the Prioress Tale, and other things. As far as I understand, that's part of classic Christian anti-Semitism, and we spoke about Christian anti-Semitism. I don't think that's a modern form of anti-Semitism. Again, it wouldn't have been called anti-Semitism; then it was called Jewish hatred. But as far as I understand, that's part of the Christian tradition of anti-Semitism. Then someone else posted, is there another element of anti-Semitism? Jews failing to meet an expected rejection of ideology or system, e.g. Haman expecting the Jews to bow to him, Mordechai rejecting Haman expected Jews to convert, Soviets expected Israel to become socialist, etc. There is, but again, I find it hard to draw a coherent pattern out of this. So I'm struggling even to process this question. Is there another element of anti-Semitism trigger Jews failing to meet an expectation or rejection of an ideology or system? The trigger of maybe in the Purim story is let me just try and draw out a theme. I suppose the question being asked is to what degree is the trick of anti-Semitism Jews just refusing to play by the rules of the game? So Haman wants Jews to bow down, Mordechai refuses to bow down. The Soviets support Israel because they expect Israel to become a communist or socialist state, and it doesn't. I don't know if there are other examples here of that phenomena. Muhammad's expecting the Jews to sign up to Islam, and then they refuse to do so. I suppose this, I hadn't thought of it in those terms. I hadn't thought of clustering all those events together. I suppose Christianity expecting the early Christian fathers expecting Jews to recognize the founders of Christianity and then refusing to do so. I put these down as just part of what I described as Jews being aliens. We're always stiff-necked and refuse to cooperate with. We're just different to whatever the prevalent norm at the time is. And this is really what I wanted to come on to the last explanation of anti-Semitism, which I think is the most profound. Whatever's going on culturally in the world and whatever the sort of intellectual fashion is, Jews are always sticking out their necks and refusing to join that. So I'm going to put that question on hold, and we're going to try and look at Jewish alien status. But sorry, Charles, I cut you off just because I saw you.
Making us far too simplistic and too easy to explain in ways. They said only Yaakov, and the reason Ishmaelim hate it, that's Esau. Yes. That's the Christian world.
Yeah.
The Muslim world is the example given on his last week's lecture, the way I've treated Ishmael.
Yes. Yes. So there are, again, I hope I categorize these as one of the subsets as a sort of spiritual rewards and punishments, direct consequence. The limitation of these is I'm not sure how many chazals there are directly around these things. So Esau Sonis Yaakov, we did discuss last week. To what degree is that like a no, it's okay. But to what degree is that a general rule or a principle, or did it mean an eternal enmity? We find within Chazal themselves, they also thought there were times of cooperation between Esau and Yaakov. The same Rashi that brings Esau Sonis Yaakov also brings Antoninus and Rabbi Zobin cooperating together. So I don't know if there's a sort of clear pattern of that, and we find the relationship between Ishmael and Klal Yisrael, the Muslim world, and the Jewish world at times being more cooperative than Christendom and its relationship to Jews. By the way, also I should mention there's a lot now floating around of people attempting to read history in line with either midrashim and predictions, astrological midrashim that predict the end game, the ends of the world, or various chazals and so on. Again, forgive me if I touched on this last time, I don't remember, but I would simply say that Jewish attempts to read history they haven't done well till now. People were convinced that the Tsarist persecutions were Gog and Magog. The First World War was Gog and Magog. The Second World War was Gog and Magog. Maybe these were potential turning points in history that somehow didn't happen. I don't know. Also, I would say eschatological. Thank you. Yeah. I'd also say thank you. I'd also say that it is the association of the West with Esau and Edom entirely accurate. Edom was a little nation on Eva Hayardim, right, somewhere in the Jordan region, which then morphed into Rome. Is Rome? It's true that in some ways the West is a continuation of Rome in some respects, but is the West exactly Edom? To what degree can we link modern nations to classic nations in the time of Tanakh, when in halachic terms we don't? Because we say that Bar Sancherev or Bil Ber Sa'umos, that Sancherev mixed up the nations, so we don't keep halachas of Amalek and Ammon and Moav. Can we?
They continue what they were doing, is not the same people. The Muslims are not the same Arabs.
Correct. And the Ibn Ezra writes that the majority of Muslims are not descendants of Ishmael, which is presumably a biological fact. So what do we really mean when we give labels to these nations? We mean they somehow philosophically carry on their well, practically or philosophically, but they're sort of ideologically descendants of these classic Tanakh sources rather than literal descendants. I just finish the point. I want to say what you've got to say, but just so when we talk about, when we say various times in history, Germany is Amalek or whatever it is, I don't. It's difficult to claim that we mean literally biologically the descendants of it. We mean that they are ideological descendants of a degree of Jew hatred that's only manifested by Amalek. So have Arabs not adopted the ideology of Ishmael? What exactly was the ideology of Ishmael, and to what degree do modern day Arabs really link to Ishmael? I'm just putting it out there. I would challenge the assumption that it's so obvious. I mean, Arabs claim a descent from Ishmael, or some tribes on the Arabian Peninsula claim descent, and some of that spreads to the rest of the Arab world. I don't know if it's obvious that these Mamori Chazal can be applied in that way. And why should those who claim descent from Ishmael or adopt the ideology of Ishmael, if that's what Islam is, and I don't see how it is really, and what do we know about Ishmael's theology, and how do we see that Islam is linked to that? Why should their domination be as a punishment for Avram's mistreatment of Ishmael if current Bnei Ishmael aren't in any way? Or maybe current Bnei Ishmael are descendants of Ishmael. The Rambam, I was asked this question actually recently in a Q&A and messed up my answer big time, and someone afterwards pointed out that I messed up my answer because I'd forgotten a source. That the Rambam seems to say that modern day Arabs are Bnei Ishmael and Bnei Keturah.
No, from Cape.
Correct, but whether that's correct or not, whether all the claims made are correct, yeah. So the Rambam does seem to say this. He says it in a halachic context, in the context of the mitzvah of bris milah, and whether Bnei Ishmael are chayv bris milah, and he says Bnei Ishmael and Bnei Keturah are mixed up together. He seems therefore to not consider the Sancherev stirring of the pot as relevant to Bnei Ishmael, perhaps because they were outside the Syrian Empire, right? The Syrian Empire never covered. He was writing in the Arab audience, it's true, but the well, yeah. But the Syrian Empire never conquered Saudi Arabia, so maybe the Arabian Peninsula, sorry, not Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, so maybe the Rambam didn't think that the Arabians had lost their descent from Ishmael. In brief, this is a long-winded way of saying I don't know. It's not clear and obvious to me that a lot of these classic sources. Sorry, yes, you were waiting patiently. I apologize.
History with faith.
Yeah.
Just that you're trying to mix up the two. History is not faith, and you can't prove faith by trying to prove that it actually happened. It's all a matter of belief, and just as we believe one thing, so they believe another. They don't need to prove the spirituality. That's not within their thinking. They just believe that we have their wording. We have perverted the Torah. We have altered the text. So when it said, for instance, which I was quite right to bring up that because that actually is fundamental to Islamic belief. When it said, take your son, your only son, there was only one son.
Yes.
He had an only son. Then it goes on to say, well, that's the history.
Okay, so I'll just address this and then I'll conclude. So just for those online, the question is, are we conflating here history and faith? The answer is yes and no. Charles' comment and my response, and indeed the Muslim world's claim of descent from Ishmael, which is perhaps an article of faith rather than of history, all that's correct. We're not aiming to prove anything about faith from this, and we're not aiming to critique or agree or disagree with Muslim claim. I'm simply saying that the prophecies around Yishmael and Edom and Porus and Modai and the ascribing to modern nations a link to some of these classic sources needs to be treated with care. It's not obvious to me that always they can be linked. The Rambam in his letter explicitly does link who was upon that. So he does link the modern day Muslim world to cater to its descent from Yishmael and so on. But whether that applies to us as well, to what degree there really is a link is not entirely clear. I was once speaking to my Rosh Hashiva, a bit sort of Ochi, about this, who sort of takes a brisker stance to these things, and I was sort of casually assuming, because at the time I thought, this was many years ago, at the time I thought that this was obvious that, Edom can refer to the modern West and so on, and he sort of looked at me as if I was crazy and said, well, what's the USA got to do with Edom, and what's, I mean, Iran maybe we can link to Porus, because that is a matter of historical certainty, that Iran is the descendant of classic Persia, that's true, so that link works, but how many of the other classic links really work? So I'll finish on that note, and in Mitzvah Hashem next week we'll try and finish off. Yes, sorry. Yeah. Yes. Acculturation. Okay, I will cover that. Yes. I will address that later, and I will also address, because someone posted on the group, very interesting discussion about hiding Jewish identity in the face of what's going on. And someone asked me on the private chat whether I could address that. I will later address that next week. I've been asked this quite a lot by people. Should we or should we not put a cap on the undergrounds, in response to Jewish hatred of Jews? So I'm not going to answer on the practical level, because everyone has to make their own thing. But are there any values that we can bring to that? And there are very interesting halachic sources around this. So again, even our topic is Jewish philosophy, I will touch on some, given that someone accused me correctly that this series has been the least philosophical I've ever done, and that is correct. It did become apparent to me that there was a need to do this therapeutically, not just halachically. So I would address that. I wish everyone a good day, including those online. Thank you so much for joining.